Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar entitled AM-50 Rifle, Reflection on Iranian Small Arms Capability and Influence. My name is Jonah Leff, and I'm the Director of Operations at Conflict Armament Research. We're also privileged to be joined today by esteemed colleagues from Janes and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Unfortunately, our moderator, Masa Ruhi from National Defense University, will not be able to join us due to some last-minute unforeseen circumstances. Instead, CAR's very own Himayu Shiotani, who heads our international policy unit, will moderate. Please also allow me to express appreciation to our donors for this event, in this case, the European Union and the German Federal Foreign Office. Today's webinar coincides with our most recent technical report, which was released yesterday on Iran's AM-50 rifle. The report seeks to promote knowledge among stakeholders from both the military and policy communities on the specific characteristics of the rifle, while also providing insights on Iran's broader small arms and light weapon production, distribution, and deployment capabilities. This event also forms part of a series of activities organized by CAR to mark our 10-year anniversary. So please do keep an eye out for upcoming events. For those of you who are unfamiliar with conflict armament research, very briefly, we are a UK-based organization that specializes in tracing illicit weapon flows, and we do so in more than 25 conflict-affected countries. We work in partnership with national defense and law enforcement agencies to identify, document, and trace weapons and related material after the point of seizure. We do this in order to piece together the chain of custody and to identify patterns of diversion from the licit to the illicit sphere. Since we were founded in 2011, we've documented more than 500,000 diverted items and traced thousands of unique supply chains. All of this information is stored and mapped on our IISS database, which we make available to policymakers and other relevant stakeholders. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping points. This is a secure platform, and all participants have joined using unique personalized links. But since technology is not perfect, we have put in place measures to deal with any disruptions. Should the virtual platform be compromised, we'll close it down and launch a new meeting in Zoom. We don't expect for this to happen, but in the case that it does, new access links will be emailed to all attendees immediately, and we should be able to resume the event within 5 to 10 minutes. We're pleased to have registered participants from member states from various geographic regions, different UN agencies, international and regional organizations, as well as NGOs, academia, and the private sector and the media. Participants joining as attendees will have their cameras and mics off by design. Attendees are encouraged to post their questions on the Q&A function at any time during the event. As time permits, our moderator will relay questions to the floor or the specific panelist that you indicate. Please do also indicate your name and affiliation if you wish to do so. Should any questions go unanswered because of time constraints, we may follow up with you and provide you with a response bilaterally after the event. As a reminder, this event is open to the public. Attendees are welcome to tweet about the event live during the webinar. And finally, this event is being recorded for further use by CAR and for record-keeping purposes. With that, thank you once again for your participation in this webinar. I really look forward to following the discussion, and over to you, Himayu.
Many thanks, Jonah. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Himayu Shiotani, and I'm the head of international policy at Conflict Armaments Research. It is a pleasure to moderate today's event, and I hope that I can fulfill your expectations in this regard. Very briefly, colleagues, let's start first by talking about why we are convening this morning or this afternoon. So the objective is really about a unique opportunity that conflict armaments research came across to look into and unpacking a recovered AM-50 anti-material rifle. And through this analysis of recovery, we started to raise a few research questions for reflection. And these research questions really point towards discussions around the rifle and the, let's say, the manufacturing entity, Iran in this case, in its implications for its production, distribution, and deployment in various theaters. And so we are really asking or trying to do three things in this event. The first is to present this technical analysis of the recovered AM-50 rifle and its components, and then to ask the applicability and limitations of such analysis to understand the broader aspects of production, distribution, and deployment in theater. The second one is to raise future questions. And really, the future questions are looking at the potential capabilities and limitations of the Iranian small arms and light weapons industry, and to offer initial observations on what patterns and trends can be understood about their distribution and deployment of such weaponry in various theaters. And lastly and thirdly is to reflect on the wider Iranian network of influence and the direct and indirect provision of weapon supply to its partners and allies and other actors in the region. And the reason why we are looking at this in a, let's say, three-tier approach is because we believe that this could be an interesting initial point of further exploration at the let's say technical, but also at the policy level, to understand better the technical capabilities, its deployment, but also how small arms capabilities of Iran fit into the broader strategy that they have, perhaps, on network of influence. So to walk us through this, let's say, objectives, we have three really distinguished panel speakers with us. First, and I'll introduce them all right now. First with us, we have Jonathan Rickle, who is a senior investigator at Conflict Armaments Research, who works within the Special Project Unit. Jonathan has previously worked in the Arms Management and Destruction Advisor for the Mine Advisory Group, and he operated within the military sphere, in particular in the weapons technical intelligence community. Jonathan, welcome, and it's good to have you here today. Second, we have Amael Kotlarski, who is the editor of the well-known Janes Infantry Weapons series, which is a print and online publication which aims to provide technical description of all known infantry weapons currently in service around the world. This covers everything from pistols to man-portable anti-tank weapons. Amael has been the editor of Janes Infantry Weapons for over 2 years. Amael, it's also a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And lastly, but not least, John Raine. John, you are the senior advisor for geopolitical due diligence at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. John is researching current and emerging themes that cross geographic boundaries, namely the use of proxies and use of non-kinetic force as a mean of projecting power and the potential of alternative approaches to conflict resolution. John, of course, many of you may be familiar, had joined the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office in 1984 and has served over 33 years in various locations, including Kuwait, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Baghdad, Istanbul. John, it is such a pleasure to have you here. And I look forward to your insights as well. So with this very brief introduction, I think we're about ready to get started. But before handing over to Jonathan, attendees, please, I want to highlight a few elements. First, as Jonah has mentioned in the introduction, you are able to interact with us through the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask as the panel session go on. You don't need to wait till the end. This way we can capture some of the elements that are being presented. So With this, I would now transition shortly to Jonathan. Jonathan, over to you. Let's first hear about this unique experience that we've had to document a recovered AM-50 rifle and its characteristics. Tell us a little bit more about that, Jonathan. Thanks.
Thanks, Amael. Right. Hello, welcome to the technical analysis section of this webinar. I'm Jonathan, and I had the opportunity to analyze images captured by a CAR field team in 2019 of an Iranian-made weapon. The weapon was seized in the Middle East. Sadly, I can't provide more contextual information about the location of that, but we remain very grateful to national partners globally who continue to grant us access to seized material in support of our activities. I thought it would be useful, perhaps for less technically minded people, to understand what this rifle is, what caliber it is, what capability and use it is put to, generally speaking. So the weapon AM-50 is Iranian made. It fires a heavy caliber cartridge, which is a 12.7 by 99mm cartridge, commonly referred to in the West and NATO allied countries as a 50 BMG. It's been in operational use pretty much for about 100 years, typically in heavy machine gun roles. And then sort of post 1980s, people really started to get interested in coupling it up with precision rifle systems for use as long-range sniper rifles or as an anti-material weapon. So what do I mean by anti-material weapon? Typically, it would be a weapon that was capable of damaging or destroying military equipment. For example, it should be capable of executing a motability kill on a light vehicle. That is, it won't fully destroy the vehicle, but it will damage components in an engine, for example, and prevent it from operating. When that same caliber is coupled with highly trained personnel in a precision weapon system, that weapon can also be used to target dismounted troops at distances beyond 1,000 meters and far in excess of the typical distances that normal smaller caliber sniper rifles are capable of doing. So it's a capable weapon. It has a significant use for denying mobility to opposing forces and is not to be trifled with. So the AM-50 rifle is itself a copy of an Austrian-produced rifle called an HS-50. The HS-50 was produced by Steyr, and in 2014, Steyr Mannlicher, as it was known at the time, exported 800 such rifles to Iran. It's important to say that at that stage, there were no legal restrictions or sanctions violations which prevented them from doing so. Shortly thereafter, we started to see these AM-50 copies being widely distributed across Iran's near abroad and to its allies in other countries. And it was observed in seizures of weapon deliveries going, according to the UN panel of experts, to Houthi rebels in Yemen. We have also encountered this across numerous social media platforms in use in Iraq and Syria. And by now, many hundreds of these rifles have been documented in weapon seizures, in particular maritime interdictions in the Middle East. So this particular rifle, which is the subject of the technical report that was released yesterday, and which I actively encourage you to download and read at your leisure, was an interesting rifle. It had been around the bazaars a little bit and was no longer in its original condition. As we observed it, it was bearing significant significant damage and signs of mishandling by the operator. In addition, we were observing on the receiver, if you look at the picture at the top, we were observing that actually the quality of surface finishing was quite poor. The surface finishing is essentially an anodizing or a bluing process that is applied to bare metal to protect it from corrosive elements. When you're applying such a finish in a factory, it requires a fully clean surface, particularly when you're coating aluminium surfaces, which is not visible on this. It seems, certainly to my eyes, to be a piece of aluminium that has been machined, left to stand and oxidize prior to anodizing. In addition, the actual degree to which the materials have been damaged and through mishandling potentially indicates that the raw material itself was poorly selected for the purpose to which that component was being put. So whilst the weapon is ostensibly, certainly as its silhouette would appear, exactly the same as the Steyr HS-50, there are significant material differences, we think, in the raw materials used. The other thing we observe, which is of particular interest for the broader picture on Iranian capabilities, is that there seems to be some disorder in the manufacturing process itself. So we're seeing surfaces and components that have received their final anodizing or their final surface treatment, after which serial number marking is taking place on the weapon. Now, the marking then removes and dislodges the surface treatment and exposes bare metal underneath, potentially decreasing its resistance to the elements. We are also seeing mismatched serial numbers. So we've seen enough of these rifles and had an opportunity to document not only this weapon, but also a weapon in Afghanistan and in other places where we have seen that the components all have matching serial numbers. So we're seeing either a full serial number on a component or the last 3 digits of the full serial number. Now, in this case, most of the numbers are mismatched. And this indicates to us that this rifle is a bit of a Franken weapon. It's been put together by assembling and cannibalizing parts from a number of different rifles of the same model, ostensibly to make one rifle which works out of potentially 3 or 4 rifles that were inoperable. The danger with this is that when you're dealing with firearms that are not designed to be fully modular, in that they are not designed to be interchangeable with other parts, they need some degree of final fit and finish to make them ready for use, is that with a mismatched number and a lack of gunsmithing or armory processes to bring everything back into tolerance, the weapon is vulnerable to either exploding or malfunctioning in some way. Now, if you observe the picture in the middle right, you'll see that that is a repaired bolt handle. Now, what we posit is that the weapon, or one of the previous weapons that has gone on, which forms part of this weapon, has been fired. It suffered a jamming event in that you can no longer remove the fired case in order to reload and fire again. And through perhaps overjudicious use of a boot, someone has tried to kick it free, and in that process has smashed off the original bolt handle. And it has been replaced either through brazing or probably more likely welding a sort of piece of metal on so that it can be brought back into service. Now, just replacing the bolt handle itself doesn't then fix the problem. The weapon, through a lack of tolerance and fit and finish, is still going to be vulnerable to a jamming event. And this feeds into the broader theme, really, and the intent of this analysis is it's to work out specifically what the actual threat posed by this weapon on the battlefield is compared to how that weapon was originally intended to be deployed. And one very key example here is to look at the optical sight that was documented fitted to this rifle, which is wholly inappropriate for both the military use to which we imagine it being put, but also for the recoil forces of the weapon itself. Now, this optical sighting system, which is the primary aiming system of the weapon, is more commonly encountered in the recreational markets by sporting shooters who fit it to an air rifle, or perhaps on a hunting rifle with a much smaller caliber, and certainly being deployed in a far less arduous battlefield condition than we would expect and anticipate this weapon to generally be deployed in. So what we have here is essentially a rifle that started off in the factory and was exported, and it posed a significant threat to opposing forces were it to be deployed with the appropriate equipment in the appropriate state of repair by the appropriate end user and operator. So I suppose we can say, looking at this weapon in isolation, we can say, well, so what? What does this tell us? And really, in isolation, it doesn't tell us a great deal. However, when we start collating all of this granular data regarding the repair, the disposition, and the end users of these sort of weapons, we can start building a much more informative picture that I would argue then could well feed into gaining a better understanding of the broader Iranian manufacturing capability, how they support their allies, and potentially what their broader strategic aims are. And one good example of how collating granular data can help inform is when we first observed this rifle and we conducted the photographic analysis and exploitation, we were seeing a serial number on the barrel, which didn't really make much sense. It had a partial number on it, and then underneath there was a full length serial number. And if you look to the report, it's number 6 on the diagram of the serial number disposition. Now, later on, when we had access to imagery regarding a maritime interdiction of this rifle, we realized that actually that serial number is the serial number of the optical site that weapon was paired with. Now, when that weapon was shipped, it was shipped separate from the scope, and the scope was shipped in its own shipping container. The intention, we presume, from looking at the serial number, being that they would then be matched back up by the end user. Excuse me. Now we say again, why? So what? Why do that? And generally, in a full military environment where you have trained snipers, it doesn't really matter which scope you have associated with which rifle, because it is the sniper as the end user who makes the final adjustments for 0. So one could posit that actually the Iranians are zeroing these rifles, getting them prepared for use, disassembling them and shipping them ready for them to be reunited. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us perhaps that there's actually not a particularly well-established military training team or military training capability on the ground with the end user, and that Iran is essentially or potentially sending this material with very little on the ground support for the end user. And they're taking every step they can to make sure that the lethality of this weapon is as high as possible for the end user. Now, what can we say if this is the case with this one weapon? Then that feeds into that being a doctrine for broader weapon deliveries to their end users and their allies. Are we, for example, going to see UAVs which are disassembled and then shipped with instructions for a relatively untrained or a remotely trained end user to assemble and then bring that weapon to bear? I mean, it bears further examination as we move forward. And finally, I'd just like to say that whilst it is of limited use to look at images on social media, it is beholden on us, I think, to rather than just look at the weapon system, is to conduct physical close reading of this sort of material when we have the opportunity to do so, because it will not only help us understand more about the weapon itself, but it will help us understand the specific threats when a particular rifle in a particular physical operational condition is observed on the battlefield, because this weapon is absolutely nowhere near as potentially dangerous as it would have been when it first got released from the factory. It is unlikely to be able to consistently reach out to the targets for which it was designed. It's unlikely to operate reliably in battlefield conditions. And therefore, we can start making specific analyses on exactly what the threat is to troops on the ground, to responders to opposing forces as we move forward. So on that, I'd like to pass back to Humayun, and thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Quite a deep dive there into AM-50. Really interesting stuff. And really, I pick maybe three things that I want to sort of reflect very immediately on. First is that you mentioned this was a copy of another rifle. And the reflection point number one is what might be some of the motives behind that? Why take let's say material rifle from something else and replicate that in mass production? That's one reflection point that I would like to maybe come back to in the discussion point. The second one is you mentioned fairly clearly that perhaps the intended purpose of the use of this item by its design and manufacturing delivery, it may not match that purpose, meaning you've observed relatively poor, let's say, finishing, as you were mentioning. I took note of that. And it really, I want to ask another reflection point here, which is we're looking at one item, right? So, is it possible that other items, if we were able to analyze, may have a better, quality finishing? Maybe there's a refinement going on. Is there a possibility that this is an earlier model? These are some questions that, of course, I'd like to come back to as well. And when we think about taking one rifle as an analysis of a point of larger, let's say, assessment. And the third and final one is a key one that you raised, Jonathan, which is, what does the accessories that come with the rifle itself and the support it is provided to the end user mean for the end user capability in theater? I think that's a big one, because it really, goes into what you talked about in terms of threat analysis, but also capability on the ground and the way that Iran may conduct its let's say, influence. And John, you'll talk about this a bit more when we come to you. But those are three, let's say, key elements of reflection that I just wanted to pick up from your presentation, with many thanks. So with that, I would like to now go to you, Amael. John's remarks led us to some key questions that I just highlighted as well. But I want to bring you in to talk to us a little bit more about Iran's broader small arms production capability, and potentially also about the operational capability of end users, listening to what John had to say. And of course, if you're able to talk about or reflect further, even if it's questions about Iran's broader capability prioritization on small arms issues, whether it's production, distribution, or deployment, that will be fantastic. So Amael, I would like to bring you in now to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amael. Hello, everybody. So as probably not a surprise to anybody researching, especially weapons technology from Iran, will know that often getting hard data on actual performance of a lot of the equipment they manufacture is not always that easy. And the Iranians seem to basically have lots for different types. Some of them are oriented towards export, and some of it is licit, some of it is illicit towards their regional proxies. And some of the equipment will only be used by the Iranians themselves for their, for their sort of national defense. When it comes to small arms, the Iranians produce a lot, at least on paper, or at least they like to display that they produce a lot. A lot of it is rarely original, and when it is original, it tends not to be all that successful. So they produce copies of a lot of foreign designs, both sort of Soviet, obviously AKs, the KL series, which were actually copies of Chinese Type 56s, but of originally Soviet designs, PKs, SVDs. They also explore various versions of copy of a SIG P226 pistol, which they actively market on some of their older marketing documentation. Quite famously, in the 70s under the Shah, or I think the late 60s, obtained a license to produce a number of German weapons, including HKG3s, both the A3 and A4 variants, which are folding stock and fixed stock, as well as MP5s, both sort of standard versions and the shorter K, which means that they have a developed a reasonably modern and developed small arms industry. The G3 and the MP5, I think sometimes I've said, oh, they're easy to produce because, well, the receivers are made of stamp sheet metal and therefore they're not that complex. I would disagree slightly. There are simple elements to these weapons, but for example, the operating system, especially the bolt, because they're delayed blowback or roller delayed blowback in this case, do have complexities in their manufacture. You better get your math right as well when it comes to manufacturing tolerances for these types of weapons. So we know that they are capable of producing slightly more complex small arms. And oftentimes at defense shows, you'll see what appear to be copies of foreign designs. There was one recently where I noticed what looked to be AK-103s and AK-104 copies, S&T K7s, sort of South Korean K7 submachine guns. They do copy other Austrian submachine guns as well, which are in service with some of their sort of naval special forces, or at least were at some point. It's unclear whether they're still actively used. But clearly what they tend to export to or send to their proxies and allies in the near abroad tends often to be sort of copies of Soviet designs, partly because of ease of maintenance. These systems are well established. They tend to be relatively simpler to operate, relatively speaking, for unqualified or less well-trained users. And ammunition, of course, is easier to source in that region and is available. I would love to be able to inspect an original Iranian G3 to be able to see what the quality level was like on these things, because a lot of the images I've personally seen of the AM-50, a lot of these rifles are quite beat up, and it's difficult to judge whether or not these are older copies or newer, or they've just seen a lot of use. And the AM-50 sort of makes sense as a weapon to copy and send over to proxies. The 50 caliber projectile is incredibly versatile and potent used in the right way, and offers quite a few interesting capabilities, not just in being able to destroy enemy material, but for example, in urban operations, counter sniping, the penetrative ability of a large, heavy round, even if it's just dealing ball and not specialized armor piercing or anything, still punches through quite a bit of the barrier penetration capability is quite significant, and in urban combat that becomes quite useful. And it's very simple. It's a single shot bolt action design, and mechanically it's about as simple as a firearm as you can sort of get. So you don't have to worry about a more complex chain of logistics. You don't have to worry about replacing magazines and springs and all that kind of stuff. It's a very simple design. And what we've also seen, what the Iranians try to do is, I wouldn't say they try to get their proxies to be self-sustained, or the equipment that they send their proxies to be self-sustainable, but they do attempt to build local capability of either maintaining or even local assembly. So we've seen that with the stuff they've been sending to the Houthis, like loitering munitions, small drones. And yes, they do send more complex systems like anti-tank guided weapon systems, even potentially cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Those you don't quite kit bash the same way as you might do something a little bit simpler, but there is an element, and we know that the Israelis claim to have destroyed a ballistic missile factory in Syria. So there is this idea that they do send stuff that is relatively simple to at least maintain or kit bash to a certain degree and remain operable. Partly is, I think it's because they have to be less reliant on having to ship stuff to their proxies, which means every time you ship something over, something might happen to that shipment. It might get interdicted, it might get lost, it might get stolen, and partly possibly also because there's an element of potential deniability, even though everybody knows that this is what the Iranians are doing in the region. There is an element of being able to say, well, actually, unless we rely on having Dowds being intercepted in the Gulf of Aden, we can distance ourselves a little bit from there. So these rifles may have, the quality of the manufacturing assembly may not be quite as good as certainly we would expect by Western standards. And 50 caliber rifles of this nature can be used as very effective long range sniper rifles in the anti-personnel role. There are a number of well established, the Macmillan TAC 50, the PGM ACAP2. There's Accuracy International Maker 50 as well. Plenty of these weapons could be used in that role. I don't quite think I agree with the analysis. I don't quite think that's what the Iranians are intending this weapon to be primarily used as, even if it can be. Certainly the choice of optics is a very interesting one, and it would not be conducive to any form of long-range accuracy, certainly not for any extended periods of time, even though a single shot 50 caliber rifle does exert less recoil perhaps and stresses on the receiver than a self-loading weapon of equivalent caliber, there's still quite a lot of force coming out that barrel, coming out that break, and being exerted throughout the structure of the weapon. So using potentially air rifle quality optics certainly won't help with that, but it still might be able to engage a vehicle or a large, not a point target necessarily, but an area target or a larger form of target, certainly well beyond 100 meters. The round is capable of doing far much more. But I think simplicity, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good enough, seems to be the overarching mentality of Iran's sort of like small arms production. If it works, it's fine. At the end of the day, there are more important, even infantry weapons on the battlefield that will tend to maybe skewer the result of an engagement, and other force multipliers. I certainly think of grenade launchers and anti-tank guided weapon systems, or even recoilless shoulder launch, various weapons of like the RPG, for example, which is very versatile and can be used for all sorts of things depending on what type of projectile you're using. Yeah, I think it clearly says that the Iranians have limited resources like everyone else, and certainly they've been on their embargo for a very long time and have managed to maintain a quite impressive domestic capability. They might decide that they're within finite resources, these things are good enough to be shipped out to their proxies to be used relatively effectively for them to be able to repair them and maintain them with a certain degree of autonomy, and that's good enough. And for sort of the cost sort of analysis, I think probably skews closer to that. And
Thanks.
yeah, I'll sorry.
Yeah, no, of
Position
course.
back to you.
No, of course, thanks. Many thanks for that. Very interesting. I think, maybe I'll start off with the point of departure of the good enough. I think that's a really interesting observation. One that maybe, John, maybe you will, as the next speaker, build on that too. Because I think, Amael, what you did very well, which I appreciated very much, was to differentiate between items that are meant for, let's say, Iran's own military capability versus those that are intended for its, let's say, allies and partners, in particular, the end user aspects of the conversation. And this item that we were discussing in particular, and the other ones that you've highlighted, that fall within the good enough category, seem to fit the latter. I appreciated you also clarifying that from your perspective, the copies are quite common, which is an interesting wider, reflection. I think in this regard, one of the main points that I sort of took away from your delivery really was about in what context do we see these items used in combination of what? So you mentioned that, even if it's not a perfect rifle, in urban operation capabilities, such a single-use sort of rifle is indeed effective to neutralize, let's say, the end user's intended target. So that's quite important. I think one last point that I wanted to sort of highlight as well was the point you made about assembly and the shipments, and limiting the number of shipments and allowing for more assembly to be done at the end user's, let's say, stage, for enabling sustainability of those operations as well, which I think is a very interesting sort of a leap way into what John will reflect as well, John, because you are talking about a distance between the supplier and the maintenance or support to its end user and its sustainability of those items. And there is some strategic thinking behind that design of delivery, if I read into what you're saying. So this is quite interesting reflection. Thank you so much, Amael, and we'll look back to you shortly in the discussion session. Thanks so much. John, I would like to now bring you on board, and you've heard quite a lot of technical insights from Jonathan and Amael about these rifles, but let's maybe take a step back and reflect on a broader contextual analysis. I've read your 2019 IISS strategic dossier on Iran network of influence, and I've noticed that it acknowledges quite commonly the direct and indirect supply of weapons being a common feature in what you described as, let's say, unconventional force. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you, potentially from examples that you used in that dossier as well in Iraq and in Yemen, how you've observed that, what that may also mean for the broader discussions about Iran's strategy and capability with regards to the unconventional force? Because we hear quite a lot in the policy sphere about the strategic weapon aspects, but I'd be also interested to hear a little bit of insight on the small arms and light weapons capability side. So John, please, over to you.
Thank you, Amael. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the geopolitics of an individual weapon, which is an unusual approach, but I think it's really valid here. And I compliment you and your team on the typically high quality piece of analysis that you've done at the technical level. I just wanted to rehearse a few important points, I think, about Iranian power projection in the region, which I think will help us as we look at the significance of this particular weapon. And these are drawn, as you kindly said, Amael, they're drawn from the work that I and colleagues did at the IISS on understanding Iran's influence networks. The first of these was the absolute centrality to the Iranian concept of power projection of partnerships. Proxies was a very popular term for a word. I prefer a more varied textured approach to their partners. We did a quite detailed typology within that dossier, just trying to communicate to readers how the Iranians themselves took a very pragmatic and variable approach to the way in which they worked with and through others in the region. And this did range from groups who one would be happy to call a proxy and say with the Iranians, and other groups in which they had sometimes a very passing, no more than a tactical alignment of interests. But whatever, partnerships were extremely important to them and remain so. So it was a way of fighting without being there. One of the features of this is that the Iranians definitely had not only a typology, but also a hierarchy, and that the levels of influence that they expected and the levels of resource that groups received, again, were highly variable. So we did see variations in the amount of both close support that some groups would receive, financial support, and indeed weaponry. Some of the observations that have been made already about good enough, simple enough, this was an important principle and remains so for the Iranians, dealing with groups often with which they would have limited contact, groups, frankly, to which they were not prepared to dedicate sufficient deployed personnel from Quds force to train in more complex systems. So that a very hands-off approach entailed pretty much dispatching weapons that they would expect to be used to the best ability of the users, but did not come with a support package. There were, however, cases where they definitely did come with a support package. And of course, as you move up the scale of sophistication, get into rocketry and ballistics, definitely that would come, and guidance systems, that would come with a support package. So the first principle was partnerships and all the variabilities that went there. And the second, which I think is also relevant to this weapon system, was durability. So one of the things that we observed with the Iranians was they generally had a planning horizon, which was very long indeed. So the expectation was to form alliances with groups that would span not just for the length of a conflict, but would also endure beyond that, and in some cases translate into political post-conflict influence within the political fabric of a country. So durability means that you need weapon systems that are basically not going to go out of fashion, aren't going to require maintenance, and aren't going to require constant upgrades. And I think this has made for the Iranians small arms and smaller weapon systems extremely attractive. So that's the second one, durability. And a third principle for the Iranians has been what I would call the Hashid or the Basij principle, which is you go for scale. So the great advantage of small weapon systems is that they can be widely disseminated. So to put it very bluntly, that's the maximum number of hands on weapon systems supplied by the Iranians, the maximum number of people who have a direct physical, if you like, connection with their Iranian sponsors. So this of course is deep in the Iranian revolutionary psyche. These are mass movements that you're seeking to enable. Everyone has an entitlement to a weapon system. You distribute as many as you can. The next principle, which I think is again very important here, was that the Iranians were very and have remained very keen to have an in-country presence, but one which is indigenous. So indigenization of effort has been very important. And in the areas of weaponization and armaments, this has taken a number of forms where the host government is prepared to supply, and that has been the case in Iraq with the Hashd al-Shabi, with the popular militia units. Then most of the supply is done by the Iraqis. There will be budgetary support from the Iranians and perhaps some tuition and presence perhaps in the command chain. But the actual work of supply can be done by a state partner. Then working down the scale, as it were, to larger, more organized groups that have their own procurement, training, distribution network. The Iranians are prepared to subvent that, but they don't want to do it instead of them. And then we're left with the smaller groups, which perhaps we're talking about here, where the Iranians would be prepared to supply them and supply them through established supply lines and LOCs, which I'll come on to later. But the important thing for the Iranians was that you did have, how can I put it, it's a presence without being there. And one of the very important reasons for this, and we saw this in the Yemen theatre in particular, is deniability, which was mentioned earlier, and secondly, casualties. So minimization of target size and casualties for the Iranians in these complex and politically very sensitive theatres was an important principle, and that in turn inclined them towards weapon systems that did not need a large specialist Iranian, an identifiably Iranian presence. I want to say a little bit about LOCs and supply lines. As you know, it has been argued by some very experienced Iran commentators that the great mistake that we made in allowing this network of influence to be established and to prosper was that we didn't interdict the supply lines, that we could have been far more disruptive. And the classic supply line, of course, for decades was supplied to Hezbollah through Syria. Other supply lines which have proved vital to maintaining Iranian projection have been the supply line to the Houthis, which again was mentioned earlier and has been a significant strategic advantage to the Houthis. The second has been, a third one has been the supply lines that have now opened through into Syria via Iraq, so through the Western Desert and into Lebanon. It is significant that the Iranians invest resource and expertise in maintenance of supply lines. So Mehane itself has been subject of much analysis for the role that it has played here, and I know your organisation is very familiar with that. One of the things that we have noticed is the growing number of militias who have been used one way or another for securing supply lines. Again, that removes the need for Iranian presence on the ground, which is a liability and a hazard, and makes good use of your local partners. But it's a fundamental feature of the sprawling network of influence that it is connected and maintained by supply lines. Lastly, I wanted, under this heading, I just want to say a little bit about the importance of the principle of asymmetry, which there's a risk we overlook, but again, directly relevant to weapon systems such as this. The Iranians have sought wherever possible not to get into peer-on-peer conflict. And we've seen that both at state level and we've seen it through their partnerships. Of course, they are informed by the bitter experience of peer-on-peer conflict early on in the revolution with the 8-year war against Iraq. They're also well aware that they're not able to match peer capabilities, either if it came to defending sovereign Iranian territory or contesting territory in a remote jurisdiction. Therefore, the emphasis has been in Quds Force doctrine on enabling asymmetric capabilities. And asymmetric capabilities are not a second best, they are a deliberate strategic choice. The advantage of them is you have higher levels of mobility, higher levels indeed of interoperability, and interestingly, we started to see that amongst elements as remote, if you like, in the influence network as Hazara and Fatima Yoon recruited in Afghanistan and cross-garrisoned to Iraq and to Syria, and with the Zainab Yoon from Pakistan similarly. So you have that advantage. the other strategic advantage that they've sought to realize here is that asymmetric warfare in complex theaters is inherently advantageous. So where you're dealing with either multiple partners or with conflict which is not governed by convention and which is against states who are limited in the amount of power that they themselves can project into the theatre, you have a real advantage if you're able to work through parties and asymmetrically. It is also, of course, over time, it's more sustainable. And lastly, asymmetric partnerships or warfare waged through partnerships does parley very neatly into political influence when it comes to settlements and post-conflict politics. So those are the sort of broad principles that we've seen the Iranians apply to their power projection. You see how each one of those is relevant to the dissemination of small-scale weapons and weapon systems. I wanted just to say a few comments about counter strategies and the huge difficulty this has posed to Iran's adversaries. The first of those, of course, is the conspicuously absent mechanism for the regulation monitoring of small arms, despite concerted efforts by the UN, NATO, and other parties, and firm espousal of creating and policing that kind of framework. It is desperately difficult to do. So the Iranians are operating comfortably below a radar here because the radar is so weak or so absent. So they are, in fact, they're a graphic illustration of how the ability to check small arm flows, including more specialized weapon systems, such as the one we're discussing today, has directly played into their hands. So their doctrine of power projection almost depends upon the absence of that regulatory system. Secondly, of course, the problem of operating in complex theaters and doing so through partners is one on which there are no legal restrictions, no restrictions relating to domestic or international law for the Iranians. There are many for Iran's adversaries. It is a difficult form of warfare, comfortably to counter for Western and indeed for all international partners without raising some fundamental challenges to the legal framework in which you are operating. So dealing with third parties, supplying them in turn with weapon systems, particularly defensive weapon systems, is by no means straightforward either legally or in policy terms. I would stick a flag in that and say it's one of the challenges where its proliferation of these kinds of weapons forces to address. Finally, just a reflection on this looking forward, I think the patterns that we have seen of Iranian power projection are highly unlikely to change after the death of Qasem Soleimani and his succession by Ismail Ghani, a long-term colleague, deputy, in some ways co-architect of this method of power projection. We have already seen indications that continuity is the name of the game. Ismail Ghani was present in Gaza during the Gaza-Israel war. That was very much a technique used by his predecessor, Qasem Soleimani. It was intended to send a signal that Iran still sees itself as the frontline state against Israel. I think there's one difference though for the Iranians, that there is a mood in the region for de-escalation, possibly even for détente. And the Iranians will have to maneuver carefully through this. I think what we will see is a transfer of a lot of their influence, which has been founded on their relationship with fighting militias. We'll see a transfer of that into the political arena. The elections in Iraq will be a test of that. The long-term ambitions of Iraq and the Quds Force will be at the very vanguard of realizing these are still the dislodgement of the US as an effective regional military force and ultimately containment of and confrontation with Israel. I don't think they will change, and a fundamental part of that will be the ability still to arm at scale large numbers of partners with simple effective weapon systems.
John, really fascinating insights. Thank you so much for that. You know, if I may just take the term that you used in your publication, the enabling framework. for the network of influence. Thanks for highlighting how weapons play a role. I just want to take a few key elements you mentioned so succinctly as a reflection for the wider panel members as we enter into the discussion modes shortly. First, fighting without being there. So the true nature of, let's say, partnering arrangements. That's something you highlighted very clearly. And within that, you mentioned about the importance of durability, simplicity, local capabilities to assemble and deploy, and to have sufficient supply networks that will enable that. And I think that all, as you mentioned, a weapon like AM-50 that we were discussing, that is simple enough to use, easily assembled, you know, what Amael called the good enough model, really fits well into the narrative that you presented. So I really appreciated that. And I think it aligns with the strategic sort of discussions that you elaborated on. I do think that this is particularly relevant, as you noted, in asymmetrical warfare or context, as you noted, where, you know, there are masses being, let's say, mobilized and moved in some complex situations. So I can see the relationship in why these items may continue to become available in theater. I think one element I want to dig deeper was also on the support package factor that you talked about. I found this relationship that you, let's say, elaborated very interesting. You said the higher the strategic value, perhaps, or influence, the higher or increased support system. And I think that's really interesting observation as well, because perhaps these, let's say, AM-50 or the small arms category is something that is easily assembled far from the presence of the Iranian context, but it is something that can be self-sustained if the material is available for simple end use. So this is also a reflection that I want to bring to the attention of Amael and Jonathan. Maybe you have some things that you want to add to that as well in terms of support packaging and how to, let's talk about sustainability of these items from a technical point of view. John, I do want to acknowledge your point about the counter strategies as well. I think that monitoring remains a key challenge for this, and potentially in reverse, it presents quite a bit of opportunity actually to strengthen. And I'm looking at you, Jonah, a little bit in a short while. I'd like to bring you in on the monitoring aspect as well. And lastly, I think this part is not, this concept of partnering and supplying items to partners is not necessarily a new phenomenon, but I do want to unpack one more layer. To what extent is the original supplier actually able to govern and monitor the subsequent, let's say, distribution of these items beyond their immediate intended recipient? This is because weapons can recirculate, they can be re-exported, as you said, from a third party, and legal applicability of those can be a challenge, although they may constitute a clear violation of end user agreements from the original state party. But the question here, interestingly, is to what extent is this influence actually controlled, or actually, in other words, enabling that force multiply to take place? This is something that I would be interested to hear from you, John, further as we think about these questions. So now I would like to, with this, colleagues, I would like to move away from the panel discussions and open up to our gallery view, where we are going to enter into a discussion. And I thank each one of you, Jonathan, Amael, John, for really fascinating discussion. But I would like to get right into it, if I may. First, let's start with you, Jonathan and Amael. Let's consider what John has just said and think about it from a proliferation aspect, right? Hearing what he had to say about the influence factors, Jonathan, you mentioned in your presentation that you've actually documented other AM-50s in other theaters as well. And in some contexts, you've actually identified matching serial numbers. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And then, Amael, if I could also invite you there to talk about what other things should the technical community be looking out for to understand the patterns of proliferation. So maybe let's go with you, Jonathan, first, and then Amael next. Thanks.
Thanks, Amael. I think the main takeaway really from observing weapons that they have their matching serial numbers across all components is that these weapons, when seized and documented by CAR staff and other stakeholders in this sector, they are documented as they would have been shipped. So there has been no malfunction of the weapon requiring the swapping and changing of components for another spare part from another broken weapon, or perhaps from a directly supplied spares package, which feeds into John's point about support packaging. And where you see an example such as that subject of the report with, you know, poor condition, multiple serial numbers, one starts to wonder at that point whether or not there was any intention for the armed group which was in possession of this weapon to have ever been supplied by Iran. Now, feeding into that broader strategic picture, it's obviously in the interests of Iran to supply its most influential, its most capable proxies with the weapon. However, should those weapons ultimately escape out into the ether and be adopted for use by all sorts of skirmishing in unofficial bandit groups, well, it sort of brings a delicious chaos to the battlefield, and chaos confuses and confounds and perhaps aids Iran to perform, you know, to sort of stay in the shadows a little and to have that degree of deniability. So where we see poor condition weapons, which have a seriously deteriorated capability compared to how they were designed, manufactured, and shipped, they still have enormous utility in the eyes of Iran, because being used in, you know, by skirmishing groups and bandits and things is just adding pressure to whichever state is trying to combat that sort of attention. So that was my point there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Amael? You're on, yeah.
Sorry, I misclicked. In terms of proliferation, I think if we're focusing on sort of the AM-50 and the general sort of idea of furnishing your partners, I recognize that proxies may be a slightly outdated, back on John's point, a slightly outdated term and a bit of a lazy one perhaps, and I completely agree with that. The fact that not only are you seeing a number of groups of quite preeminently mediatized groups, often quite publicly display the AM-50 during parades, etc., or even during the combat footage or photography they take themselves and for their own media purposes. You also see in Syria, notably, a sort of cottage industry of local gun makers and a number of locally manufactured designs, not just in Syria, but also in Kurdistan, sort of it's kind of within that region, of locally sort of craft-made AMRs, a lot of them using repurposed sort of heavy machine gun barrels, Dushkas, KPVs, NSVs if they can find them, and basically the barrels are difficult to make at a high quality for these kinds of weapons. So if you have an existing barrel, a decent gun maker can actually design a receiver. Most of these weapons are magazine fed, but usually bolt action simplifies things in the design process. So there is an established need for these kinds of weapons that can provide a certain degree of overmatch to different battlefield targets. Now, depending on who they're up against, none of these rifles are actually capable of taking out any form of decently armored vehicle. Certainly not without a degree of accuracy, and certainly not without specialist ammunition. But they can take out, you know, technicals, even slightly up-armored ones. They can certainly perform extremely well in the anti-personnel role. There's not much body armor that can protect you against a projectile of that caliber, even at long range. Again, urban combat, the ability to destroy barriers or remove barriers. You may not be able to destroy your intended target, but for example, punching large holes through a wall where someone is hiding behind, you may actually get them to move out the way, which also serves a tactical benefit, for example. And certainly these weapons, specifically in urban combat, are very useful because, again, you're potentially going up against opponents who are in cover behind quite thick cover, you know, concrete walls, brick walls, all sorts of stuff. Maneuvering a heavy machine gun, especially a belt-fed heavy weapon like of that caliber, is not the most practical thing in the world, especially around, if you're shooting and scooting, or even from position. It really isn't practical. These weapons weren't designed for that. That's often why you see them mounted on tripods or pintles on vehicles. I'm not going to say that AMRs are practical weapons. Any soldier who's basically carried one will tell you that it's not a pleasant experience for any extended amount of time. They are large and heavy, and the ammunition is large and heavy as well, but they are much more maneuverable than a heavy machine gun of equivalent caliber, and therefore more flexible for small scale sort of skirmishes and hit and run tactics and ability to retain that sort of barrier penetration capability and defeat with retaining a certain degree of mobility and not necessarily completely exhausting the user in the process. So certainly you will likely see more and more groups attempt to either use these weapons in either the AM-50 or even design their own, or even should they capture some off opposing governmental forces or other partners that may have received similar types of weapons from their benefactors. And again, anti-material rifles are not designed to be pinpoint accurate. Their primary role and their primary function, and it's where their real value lies, and that is a value that was recognized by the US military when they first adopted the M82 and sort of started the bigger trend of the sort of anti-material rifle, but also, and it's extremely valuable for non-state armed groups who have more limited resources, is that you can damage or destroy very, very expensive pieces of equipment with a relatively inexpensive system. The rifle itself doesn't cost that much. We've seen that the quality isn't great and probably doesn't cost the Iranians a huge amount to make. The ammunition is dirt cheap, relatively speaking. You can punch a hole through a ground-based radar system. You can punch a hole through an engine block. You can punch a hole through a grounded helicopter or a jet fighter on the tarmac. You won't destroy it, but you'll take it out of the fight, and you'll cost your opponent. War is often the large degree of economics that factor into warfare. It is not should not be underestimated. They can do a lot of damage to very sensitive equipment should they find themselves in the right place at the right time. And that should not be underestimated. It is a real force multiplier, even if it's not the most, you may not be able to take out enemy personnel at 2,000 meters because they may not have the training for that either, and the right ammunition, and the right support, and the right, etc. But you can certainly do some damage with these things, and they are significant force multipliers. In many sense, almost perhaps not quite as versatile, but in many sense, the way we've seen these groups use guided anti-tank weapons to take out high-value targets, enemy structures, etc. Not exactly what these systems were designed for initially, but they are versatile enough to be able to do these things, and therefore can relatively speaking, destroy high-value targets at a much minor cost. Again, if you're Iran and supplying these types of weapons, you want to maximize the effectiveness of your partners without necessarily breaking the bank. Again, Iran is not the wealthiest country in the world. They have been under significant economic pressure, under the sanctions and now with the pandemic, etc. So that does factor in. The Iranians don't have infinite money to start spending to arm their various partners to further their interests. So they need to maximize their cost. So the cost-effective analysis, essentially.
Thank you, Amael. Really, really fascinating, both Jonathan and Amael, on that point. And I want to take what you said, Amael, back to John. John, your analysis was on point about the local capabilities, right? Because Amael just noted of a phenomena that's quite commonly observed now, which is local production. And so there are research questions that come up, as Jonathan was saying as well, that perhaps some of these are actually assembled or even manufactured locally away from the Iranian manufacturing in Iran, for example. So, the concept that you elaborated is really much applicable here. My question back to you, John, is this. Are you aware, or is there a phenomenon or any observation about a feedback from the end user back to Iran on these items? So, for example, if they were to be produced or subsequently distributed by a third party to an end user, is there a relationship loop back to Iran about the, let's say the quality of these items, the effectiveness of them, what type of additional weaponry they might need to conduct operations? Because you noted in the dossier, of course, that there are some tailored packaging as well. John.
Yeah, thanks, Amael. I'll answer that. First, I want to really endorse what Amael said, because there's a great point there, Amael, about the very heart of the asymmetric doctrine is to inflict maximum cost with minimum resource. And we've seen this time and again with the Iranians. Personally, I think that one of the big lessons they learned from the war in Lebanon, 2006, Hezbollah versus Israel, was that you could stop, one of the world's most effective military machines, you can just grind it to a halt if you have appropriate deployed asymmetric weapon systems. Again, other relevant factors here as they learned the importance of mobility. They've also learned the importance, more recently, I'm talking about Hezbollah now, of joint ops and even multi-domain fighting when they were in the improbable arrangement with the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians. But when we're talking about smaller weapon systems, I think they learned lessons then which have been disseminated through the wider Iranian network of influence. And on your point, Himay, I think the level of feedback that the Iranians get here depends very much on the sort of weapon system. So yes, when it comes to the top end guidance systems, rocketry, even ballistic missiles, that there is a feedback loop there. There is customization. But the principle of indigenization that I talked about earlier is a very strong one, and it's been it's also one of the things that's hardest to counter, because take a if you like a political example of this. The Iranians have no natural cultural affinities to pull on with the Houthis. You can make something out of the Zaidi connection, but it's not, frankly, on its own, that's not enough. But they use Hezbollah as the Arab-speaking partner to forge the cultural link, to ensure that it was indigenized, that the Houthis were seen to be a local Yemeni Arab-speaking organization, not something controlled by distant Persians. Same, as far as we can see, has also applied to weapons manufacturing and maintenance. If this can be done locally, that's the Iranian preference. It's only when you get to the more sophisticated equipment, which I think Amael and others touched on, where you simply got to have a package to make sure it works. One of the things that we did notice was that in cases, again, Ansarullah is a good example here, the Houthis, where the Iranians had shared capabilities which were higher end, they were also nervous about the way they were deployed. And it was less the onward proliferation risk, it was simply that the local partner would use them at the wrong time or in the wrong way. So you've got a kind of hovering over them just to make sure, try to establish some kind of C2, some oversight, so that you were in charge of it. You had that degree of control you were talking about over the weapon system. There was a question I noticed in the chat on onward proliferation into Africa. I think the short answer is yeah. I mean, these weapon systems are all going to leak out, and we've seen them leak out. And I know you've done some great work on Iranian weapon proliferation in Africa too. It's a problem which I don't think the Iranians care about. Just don't care about it. It's not a material consideration. They're worried about the immediate and the effective user. They're not worried about the ultimate end user.
Thank you, John. Really interesting. Again, Jonathan, I saw your hand, so I'm going to come to you right now. But after I come to you, Jonathan, let's bring some of the questions from the audience in, and I can facilitate that. But Jonathan first, and then I'll come back to you. Cheers.
It was just to make a very small point on ammunition selection, which I think is one of the questions from Isaiah Johnson there. So, I mean, one of the issues with the 50 BMG or the 12.7 by 99 cartridge is that it is a cartridge commonly used in the West by NATO forces and then supplied to friendly forces. Now, from the Iranian perspective, rather than equipping their partners with commonly available former Soviet calibers, Russian weapon systems, etc., if they provide 50 BMG NATO weapons without the ammunition and make it beholden on those forces to obtain through looting, through various other means, NATO ammunition, they've almost set a time limit on the lethality of those groups with those weapons, because when the threat of NATO forces and NATO supported forces go away, then so presumably does the continuous supply chain of ammunition, bearing in mind that ammunition is a consumable commodity. When it runs out, the weapon might as well be melted down and used for something else. So I'll pass on to Amael there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. So if I may just quickly, I think there's also a consideration of, again, going back to 11 at the perfect getting away of good enough, the original weapon, the AM-50 is copied from, was chambered in 12.99, and it may simply not have been worth it for the engineers to adapt the design to 12.7 Russian, which is 12.7 by 108, which is true, a more commonly found 50 caliber cartridge in those regions, but you would have to potentially redesign the bolt. You'd have to certainly improve the materials, because that is a much higher pressure cartridge. There's a lot more powder in that cartridge than the 50 BMG chamber, etc. They probably decided, for simplicity's sake, it wasn't quite worth it, and it was easy enough for them to supply them with 50 BMG. I actually believe the Iranians make 50 BMG themselves. They produce it, so I need to double check that on, but I believe they do. It wouldn't be, the Iranians produce a whole host of small arms, or small caliber, even medium caliber, large caliber ammunition. It wouldn't be difficult for them to produce 50 BMG. The dimensions, etc., are all well known at this stage. They have the production facility, so if all cases fail, they can supply that ammunition to their partners if need be. But presumably, it's not too difficult to procure that stuff in region anyway. Yeah, I think they just keep it simple. The Austrian engineers did all the calculations. They've got all the dimensions, etc. Everything works with 50 BMG. We just have to copy it, and it'll be good enough, I think.
Thanks. It's really interesting, because the common message here is really starting to align: simplicity, durability, local assembly. Good enough use on the deployment. They all fit this broader enabling framework that John was talking about. Jonah, I want to come to you now, actually, and loop in a question from the audience. And it sort of aligns to the discussion that we were just currently having on the ammunition side. So there's been an observation made that specifically relating to Iranian shipments to Houthis. Why haven't we seen, for the most part, ammunition, 12.799 millimeter or otherwise, in various maritime seizures? How and from where do Houthis source their ammunition? This is an interesting question specifically for this panel, but also on a broader reflection, John, as well. The question about ammunition and their role is something to reflect further on. So let's maybe start with John. Of course, Jonathan, Amael, if you have any inputs on that, I welcome you to join as well. Jonathan, Jonah, please.
Yeah, I realize there's several of us with J's. No, it's a really puzzling dynamic, and it's a great question. I think the question refers to these maritime interdictions, which have taken place over the last 5 or 6 years in kind of great quantity, in terms of episodes of interdictions, as well as the quantities of weapons that we've seen aboard these interdictions. And as he rightly stated, we have not seen a single round of ammunition that was part of these consignments. And I think it says a few things. Number one, and this is coupled with the research that we've done in Yemen, we've seen that when the Houthis took over, there were vast quantities of previous state-held ammunition stocks that they accessed. And in addition to that, and specifically NATO caliber ammunition, I think they also had access, or steady access, to losses that were seized or in some ways obtained from coalition forces. The coalition was previously the Emiratis, as well as the Saudis, who remain on the ground, and in addition to their partner forces who had been armed and equipped by them. Like Jonathan rightly mentioned, ammunition is a consumable item. So I don't think this means that we should ignore this, because certainly these stocks are going to run out, and if they haven't already. So it's a good reason to keep our eye on this. We haven't seen any shifts yet, but I would anticipate that we will soon start to see new patterns and supply chains of ammunition emerging in the short future. Thanks.
Thanks. Please, Amael.
If I may hop on that, I think also, just because what's the old saying, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Just because perhaps ammunition shipments have not been seized doesn't mean they don't happen. There are plenty of people in the region who also make this type of ammunition, and shipments may be able to be diverted from other either captured stocks or diverted from other providers. Certainly, again, I don't think they're going to be issuing the high spec stuff. I presume what these guys are firing through the AM-50 is D-linked M33 ball or equivalent. Maybe they have access to more specialized sort of, rounds with, thinking of the Rofus round, etc. But that's unlikely, considering that's only really issued to Western forces and unlikely to find its way in sort of the open market, or certainly I don't think it has been copied by Iran. But again, this doesn't need to be the highest quality grade ammunition either. For some 50 cal, as long as the dimensions are right and it will fire, it'll be good enough. And again, plenty of countries in the region have the capability of manufacturing that kind of ammunition, and I'm very certain the Iranians, if they don't, then they are capable of manufacturing that caliber. It shouldn't be too much of an issue to supply them from various sources.
Thanks, Amael. Once again, highlighting the importance of indigenous capability or local capabilities, even on the ammunition side. That's something that I will take note of right now as potential areas of further examination. Colleagues, this is fascinating, and we could probably go on for some time, but we are approaching the end shortly. And so what I wanted to do was, of course, acknowledge that there are other questions from the audience that we were not able to get to, but we will certainly take note of them, and where applicable and appropriate, we'll loop back to the participants to address these questions. But before we close and hand over to Jonah for closing remarks, colleagues, this was meant to be an initial reflection together. And I think a lot of interesting insights were shared, but also question raised. So going in the order of Jonathan, Amael, and John, can I maybe ask you for a final remark, perhaps to sort of, if there were one or two things that you wanted to research further moving ahead, what that could be from both technical and policy side. So Jonathan, let's start with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Amael. I think the main sort of next step for me as regards to the methodology that we've sort of showcased and with this case study is continuing to conduct granular exploitation of individual items. Particularly for us, we very often only have one opportunity to document a weapon system or an item, and to try to glean as much information from that one opportunity as possible, because actually, who knows, this debate has certainly given me some ideas about next steps, potentially where we might want to go. And one of those, just to give you a very sort of, just to give you an example regarding Iran, is we're increasingly seeing an assault rifle that they manufacture, which is known as a KLF. Through the close macro photography of markings, we're consistently observing that there seems to have been some obliteration of a serial number and a remarking of a number in line with Iranian methodology, so dot peening marks on the receiver, for example. Now, we're seeing this often enough for us to start to infer that maybe actually this KLF might not be made at all by the Iranians, and that this is exactly what it looks like, which is a Chinese Type 56, potentially with the serial numbers erased, and then it's been given a sort of Iranian brand. So being able to gain access to these items, to really fully exploit them using the various suite of technologies that CAR and others are creating, will actually help us confirm that. And that in itself will certainly help inform, I think, the debate on military capabilities and production capabilities within Iran. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's really interesting, actually, and it opens up another sort of box of questions, really, about intentions as to why there will be an applied Iranian marking on an item that's manufactured by another state. But that's something maybe we could explore further, certainly within this organization. Amael, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly the Chinese connection would be something personally I would be very interested in. I also noticed that the Iranians market their PKM copy as the PKM T80, which is a reference to the Chinese copy of the PKM, which is referred to as the Type 80. So that's maybe there's another connection there. Who knows? It's certainly interesting. I would love to be able to see more detailed reports about this, especially about Iranian sourced weapons, because for me, there's always been a difficulty in first being able to observe these weapons in hand for various reasons. I also live in the UK, so I have to go through specialist sources to be able to access those in person. But the Iranians produce a lot of stuff, and it's always quite difficult to it's not always that simple to realize what is actually posturing, in a sense, what they are trying to sell to the world as their capability, as their manufacturing capability, or as simply one-offs that they've decided to put on display. They don't, if the Iranians generally show something off, there's a purpose to it. They don't, it's not, oh, someone just snapped a picture at a defense show and released it online. It is communication. They do it on purpose. And it's sometimes quite difficult to figure out if this stuff is actually in production. It's not, it goes beyond small arms, of course. Obviously, there's also big questions around Iran's ability to domestically produce electro-optical systems, radar systems, etc. You know, degree of foreign help they potentially receive from other people. So it's part of that wider sort of interrogations that we often see as observers of weapons technology, but in Iran in particular, as to how legit is it really? Is it communication? Is it something that they actually can make? Is it something that they can deploy? And if they can, what's the quality? How does it work? Is it you know, the durability, all these kinds of things? So certainly the work of CAR is really interesting in that sense, and kind of helps a sort of wider body, not just in understanding Iran's production capabilities, but also understanding how to trace these weapons and how to source them back to simple stuff as receiver or parts markings, for example. If we can establish patterns on that, we can actually better understand where weapons are being shipped from to, and also help with the wider sort of community in terms of arms control and understanding flows of illicit weapons and be able to trace them back to the source. Even as simple as so creating identification documents to be able to, you know, help people identify the difference between a Iranian KL from a Chinese Type 56 to other forms of weapons that may be copies of, and sometimes, and often is the case with, especially with small arms identification, is the devil's in the detail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amael. Really interesting. You know, this question, you sort of got into the question of intention between actual capabilities for military purpose, prestige perhaps even, and then separate to that, as John was not talking about, that being maybe even separate to the partnering, let's say, arrangement that they have and the equipment that they prepare. So John, I think this is a really good transition for your final remark and reflection questions that you might want to explore further. Thanks.
Thank you, Amael. Well, I'll pick up on Amael's comments that there's a huge policy challenge here, which this weapon system alone illustrates vividly, and that is, how do we better monitor and regulate the illicit dissemination of small arms and light weapon systems? Everyone has accepted that they are the fuel for chronic conflicts and disputes. Few have yet accepted that the ability of a state to disseminate these illicitly actually gives them a strategic advantage. And those states, as in case Iran, are our adversaries. So I think it's also important that we stop looking just at the big weapon systems, which grab the headlines. That's everything from nukes down to multiple rocket launches. But that top bracket has dominated public attention and policy-making attention. I think now that we need to start focusing on what is it on the day-to-day basis that allows Iran in particular to project its power. There's a coalition waiting to happen, I think, between governments, NGOs with expertise in this area, and local actors. It requires some innovative thinking, I think, to make that happen. And I'd like to see some kind of experimental theatre work just to see whether or not at least progress can be made in collection, marking, decommissioning of these weapons, better understanding where they came from, how they're being used, and by whom. And my final thought is that as Iran tries to rehabilitate itself, if it does, then a discussion with the Iranians at the highest level about this problem has got to be held. It's not an issue that we can afford to just ignore. It's a strike against this regime as great as the strike against them for nuclear aspirations, human rights abuses, anything else. It's got to be on that post-conflict agenda.
Thanks, John. Really interesting sort of wrap to this. We're right on time, Jonah. So with this, I want to just thank Jonathan, Amael, and John. thank you so much. This was a really fascinating initial discussion. I see a lot of potential for further research and dialogue on this area. So on behalf of the organization, thank you so much. And with this, I will also hand over my responsibilities over to Jonah for closing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Himayu. Yeah, I agree. This has been really fascinating and probably way too short. We could go on and on, but this is really just the beginning, I think, of discussions that we can have around these issues. And you all have done an exceptional job in, I think, framing them. And I think that this one rifle is just a really good illustration of how the recovery, the exploitation, and analysis of a single rifle can spark such expansive debate and strategic discussion and insights into capabilities. And of course, we will continue to refine our understanding as we encounter this rifle as well as similar weapons in our field work, and we'll promote that understanding as we have today. And with that, I just want to remind all the audience that our report on the AM-50 rifle is available on our website, and to please keep an eye on this space for future exploration of some of the research questions that have been raised in this event. And yeah, finally, thanks to all of you who have taken your time today to attend this and share your questions. We really appreciate your interest in this work. Please do have a great rest of your day and stay safe.